A couple who laugh when they are told of a wonderful promise from God, not from joy, but because they do not believe it. A privileged man whom God speaks directly to, and he responds by asking God to please go talk to somebody else. An ardent follower of Jesus who ends up in prison and questions if he is really the Messiah. A group of folks who experienced firsthand the miracles of Jesus and then go on to deny and desert him. What do all these people have in common? They are examples of what faithful followers of God look like in the Bible. So as Olivia/Tito said, we are beginning a new series based on one of the Press House impact objectives, which is to help people develop a deeper and more mature faith. It's one of our impact objectives. As students, many of you come to this university to gain knowledge, to gain skills that you can put to use in a career, whether that's coding or running a lab or teaching a class, leading an organization. There's the skills that you want to learn and be able to go and put out to use. Well, here at Press House, we're striving to create a community where you can learn and grow in ways that will empower you to follow God more faithfully here on campus, of course, but when you go out into the world. But what does a deeper faith look like in a person? And I agree, Nathan, I'm not talking about legislating that for everyone, but if we think about what does a deeper faith look like, how do we get there? The snapshots I just described from the Bible may not be the first examples that come to mind, and yet Abraham and Sarah, Moses, and disciples like John the Baptist and Peter, they are considered giants amongst our spiritual ancestors. See, faith is often confused with certainty, and religious belief with rigidity. But these stories from Scripture paint faithfulness in a very different manner. Time and time again, Scripture describes the wrestling, the questioning, the messy ways that humans follow God, and they are often full of doubts. Doubts about God, doubts about themselves, doubts about others, and they are uncertain about how things will unfold. Faithfulness is not so much about having it all figured out, your life running smoothly. Rather, there is a lot of stumbling around and missteps, precisely because following God inherently means you are going to go to unfamiliar places where you do not know everything or your way around. So let's take a closer look at some of these portraits of faith, as I would call them, that we find in the Bible. This first one is from the book of Genesis. So what would you do if you had hoped to become a parent, and God had even promised you that you would, but then you turned 50, and then 60, 70, 80, 90 years old? Being the smart students that you are and understanding basic human biology, you would let go of that dream. Perhaps from the perspective that age can bring, you might be able to laugh rather than grieve as you did when you were young and married. That is exactly how Abraham and Sarah responded, the ancestral parents of Israel. That's how they reacted when messengers from God made a surprise visit and told them they would have a son. Who could believe it? Certainly not them. And so they laughed. I imagine an ironic ha coming from their lips, for this message might have even felt cruel after so many years of waiting. Some of us have experienced so much disappointment in our lives and had our hopes dashed that we have become cynical about God's promises. When we hear messages about God's love for us, God's visions for justice and mercy, like Sarah and Abraham, we just do not believe it. Here's another portrait. What if you had the opportunity to make a significant difference in the world? Now, I mean like Nelson Mandela level of impact, where you could liberate an entire nation. What if God was the one who personally delivered this news directly to you, promising to be at your side as you engage in this revolutionary work. Well, if you were Moses, you would say, pass, no thanks, and ask God to please go talk to somebody else. For some of us, when we realize the risks involved in responding to God's call to do justice, we become overwhelmed and scared. Like Moses, we beg God to ask someone else to go so that we can just get back to our life as usual, tending sheep. It may not be super exciting, but life is at least a little more predictable. Next, let's take a look at John the Baptist, famous prophet who announced to the world the Messiah was finally here. John was unafraid to do outlandish things to draw attention to the message of God. He was not cowed by people in power, and such was his belief that his cousin Jesus was the Messiah that he was declaring to the world, this is the one we have been waiting for. Except, things did not go according to plan. And eventually John was arrested by the authorities and thrown into prison. From prison, when he heard what Jesus was doing and what he was up to, it confused him even more. And so, after telling thousands of people that Jesus was the one, he secretly sent his disciples to ask, are you the one? Or is it someone else? What he was once so sure of was now a serious question. Some of us have had things which we thought were rock solid come loose because our expectations of how God will act and the way the world will work were shaken. So one more portrait of someone who was intimately close to Jesus, somebody who spent all his time with him during his public ministry. The disciple Peter. He was passionate, the kind of guy where when everyone else was hesitating and not sure what to do, he was the one to go head first. It was Peter who stepped out onto a stormy sea while everyone else was stuck terrified in the boat, and then walked towards Jesus, but also the one who started to drown as soon as he started to see the waves. Jesus called Peter both the rock on which he would build his church, a glowing endorsement. And then, in just a few verses later, Jesus calls him Satan, telling him to get out of his way. And Peter, filled with faith and loyalty, he vehemently declared that he would die for Jesus, only to be found just hours later denying that he even knew him, and then deserting him in the time of his most desperate need. Some of us are like Peter, erratic, with days where we are filled with hope and faith, and then days where we flounder spectacularly, contradicting everything we have purported our life to be about. Sarah and Abraham, Moses, John, and Peter, they are amongst our most revered spiritual ancestors, but not because they had it all figured out. These snapshots of their lives remind us that the reason they became so faithful was because they had journeyed through some serious doubts and uncertainties, where they were forced to question old assumptions, a challenge beyond what they thought was possible. To grow and mature necessitated a disruption to their norms because God was taking them to places they had not gone before. That meant there would be times of falling on their faces, but also incredible transformations in the cultivation of a deeply rooted faith. Cultivating a deeper and more mature faith, it is not a smooth journey. It is challenging and risky because following Jesus is not predictable. It is not a safe process. And perhaps that is why we so often settle for a watered-down version of faith that does not demand much of us. Ultimately, however, those shallow roots leave us unsatisfied, especially when life throws us a curveball. If we want to grow in faith, it will inevitably take us out of our comfort zones and be a little, or probably a lot, messy. For some of you, that might look like examining the beliefs that were handed down from your families and comparing them to the voices which are new to you. For others, it might mean opening yourself up to the possibility that God's promises are actually true for you, and then responding to her call to live into that reality. You will not know how the journey will unfold or exactly where you will end up, even when you are 90. This is the nature of following a wild and loving God. Perhaps it seems a bit daunting, so I want to close with the portrait of faith from the scripture passage that Sam read today. It brings together real-life problems and a developing faith. In this story from the Gospel of Mark, there is a lot going on. The disciples of Jesus, supposedly the ones who perform all the miracles in his name, they were stuck. A parent had brought his sick child for healing, and they could not do it. They couldn't do it. And so what ensued was this very public argument with other religious leaders about why. Meanwhile, Jesus shows up on the scene, and the child is thrown into a seizure, his body collapsing to the ground with uncontrollable movements. It is awful to witness, and one can imagine how desperate and exhausted his father is from trying to find help for his child for so many years. You can hear both the despair and a tiny bit of hope in his voice as he asks Jesus, if you were able to do anything, have pity on us, help us. After all, his disciples were not able to do anything. When Jesus responds, if you were able, all things can be done for the one who believes, the father immediately cries out, I believe, help my unbelief. Jesus proceeds to heal the boy, albeit in a way that makes everyone think he's dead. And then he leads the child on shaky legs into the house so that he can fully recover. It is not what anyone expected. It was beyond what everyone thought was possible. I do believe. Help my unbelief. I think that is one of the most honest declarations of faith that there is in Scripture. One that encapsulates what it looks like when we are in the act of growing deeper. It reflects an engagement with the world that recognizes both the promises of God that we hold on to, despite the most troubling realities which can overwhelm us. Faith and doubt, they are not opposites. They are two sides of the same coin that coexist in a dynamic tension. I do believe. Help my unbelief. Growing necessarily means venturing into unfamiliar territories. We will likely stumble, maybe even fall flat on our faces. But we can be reassured that God is with us every step of the way. I think it is helpful for us to remember that when things get messy and we find ourselves unsure, those are not signs of a weak faith. Rather, they are the inherent growing pains that are part of the process. So developing a deeper and more mature faith, it will require ups and downs, twists and turns. You cannot predict it, just as our spiritual ancestors could not. So in the next few weeks, as we explore ways to take steps out of faith, specifically, we're going to be talking about how do we read the Bible, radical action, queer love. Let this declaration be our prayer as we seek to grow together. I do believe. Help my unbelief.